What's up guys, it's Z here, welcome back to Yugioh Deck of the Day. Today we have an update on Traptrix, a deck that I think that throughout these years has gotten really good support, and now Lightning Overdrive just gave it exactly what it was looking for in order to become a really good rogue deck. And there are a lot of versions of the deck out there. You can play them with Dogmatica, you can play them even with the new amazement cards that are from Lightning Overdrive too. But for the sake of this video, I decided to make the deck as budget as possible because Traptrix has always been the budget-friendly control deck that a lot of people have enjoying, and I know that most Traptrix players don't really want to break the bank for stuff like Nadir and Ecclesia, and even the new amazement cards actually do have a couple of expensive cards in the set, and because you do have to pick up a couple of ultra rares from the set in order to get exactly what you need, I decided to make more of a pure version to make it as budget as possible. But of course, if you want to make it even more competitive, you can put in even more cards like Dogmatica and Amazement. But yes, this is a budget version of the deck, so before we begin with the video, if you enjoy it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and now let's get to the deck profile. So starting off with the monsters, we have 3 copies of Mirmello. Mirmello is the best card you want to normal summon turn 1 because it searches you a trap hole, so you have even more interruption, and she's basically the one you want to be using as a normal summon turn 1 and special summoning it throughout the later stages of the game, because when she's special summoned, you can pop spell and traps your opponent controls, and this effect is actually a mandatory activation, so even if there is no spells and traps on the field, her effect will still activate, so you can trigger Sarah's effect, so this is a cool trick to keep in mind when you're playing this deck. Next up, we have 3 copies of Mantis. Mantis has become actually a lot better now that we have a really good searchable target, because usually with Mantis what you were doing is you were normal summoning her, you were searching a Dionia for a follow-up turn, and then you were going to your Sarah, but now you have something you can search that will give you immediate advantage the way you search it, and I'm going to get to that a little bit later. Also, Traptrix's second effect, Mantis' second effect, is actually very relevant, because when Dionia is special summoned, she puts a hole from the grave back into the field, but will be banished during the end phase of the next turn. But with Mantis, if you bounce this card back into your hand and then reset it, it actually completely dodges Dionia's downside, so it's going to go back into the grave no matter when you activate it. So when you're trying to play this deck as most efficiently, you need to figure out these little tricks you can do with cards like Mantis, Sarah, and all those other cards that will get you the most amount of advantage as possible, because grind decks have the problem of being overwhelmed when your opponent has a lot of stuff, so you need to be able to keep as much advantage as possible in order to be able to outgrind them, and this is what Sarah was really good for the deck, because she gave you all the advantage that the deck couldn't really get on its own. And now we have an even greater card than Sarah. Yes, I think that this card, Sarah fixed a lot of problems, but the deck was still really mediocre, but I think the next card I'm going to show you fixed pretty much every problem that Traptrix had. So here we have 3 copies of Traptrix Vesiculo. So first of all, one of the deck's biggest weaknesses was that it would lose to Gamma. So when you're going first and you're summoning something like a Mirmello or a Mantis, you had either 2 options. Either activate their effect, which is the optimal thing to do because you want to get as much advantage as possible, get Gammaed, and that's basically put an end to your turn because you would just set your back row, but just setting back row in this deck is not very optimal because without Sarah on the field, you don't get any advantage out of those back rows. So even if your normal summon gets Gammaed, this card is a card that helps you get another monster on the field. So what this does is you send a set trap card to the graveyard, and then you special summon this card from your hand. And it also has a recovery effect that you cannot use both effects in the same turn, but doesn't really matter, that if you have no cards in your spell and trap zone, you banish from the grave this card, and then you set a hole from your grave to your field. So this card has multiple purposes. The first one is this one I said with Gamma. The second one is that it gives you another option to go into Rafflesia turn 1, even if you don't open Exceed or even if you don't open the Shade Brigandine. So what you can do is you can special summon her first before you even commit to your normal summon, link her for Sarah, and then normal summon a Dionia, bring her back, and then not only are you going to trigger Sarah's effect, but you're also going to get a Rafflesia without even having to hard draw an unsearchable card like Shade Brigandine or the Parallel Exceed. So this is why Vesiculo gives a little bit more for the deck that needs, because it relies a lot on having these cards in order to do a really good power play turn 1. Otherwise, the best play you can do is summon a Sarah set 4 and pass, which is not everything that's going to win against any deck, because there are cards that blow out this deck completely, and being able to summon a Rafflesia turn 1 means that you're not going to lose to cards like Lightning Storm. Also, getting to Rafflesia turn 1 is very important because people that know what the deck actually does, they are not going to commit to the board, they're just going to normal summon something and try to run over Sarah before they do anything so that you don't get the advantage. It was able to be countered before with cards like Compulse and stuff like that, but being able to summon a Rafflesia and a Sarah on the field means that Sarah will not be able to be destroyed by battle, so that's very optimal. And even if your backer gets wiped by a Harpy's Feather Duster or a Lightning Storm, you still have an interruption with your Rafflesia on the field rather than just having only Sarah and a couple back row. So Vesiculo gives you 3 more options to go into Rafflesia, which is more consistent than having only 6. So this is why this card is such a great addition for the deck, and I think that you have to max it out. Also, if people wanted to make the deck more consistent before, they would have to put cards like Epethans, like Atrax in the deck, which weren't very optimal, because playing only 9 Traptrix monsters meant that there would be a lot of games where you would not open a Traptrix to go into Serra, but you wanted to do that, so even if it meant playing cards that don't really do anything on their own, like Nepenthes and Atrax, which their effects are very mediocre, now with Vesiculo in the deck, you have 12 good Traptrix you can play, and 12 is a really good number, so you're going to see most of the time a Traptrix in your hand to go into Serra, so she fixes that problem as well. So as you can see, this card does so much for the deck that Serra alone could not do, but now with her and Serra, you have so much more that you can do, so this is why you absolutely have to max out on this card. Next up is 3 copies of Traptrix Dionia. Dionia, of course, is the Wolfpark of the deck, the follow-up. You special summon a Traptrix from the grave, you go into your rank 4s, you have, of course, the Utopia OTK, which I think is something that you need to implement in a deck like this, because in slower control decks, there is the threat that there is no ever going to OTK, because your opponent can just think like, okay, I'm not going to get OTK, so I'm not going to commit the board, I'm going to wait a little bit until I have everything I need to win. But when you have something like Utopia Double, just leaving a monster on the field face up means that your opponent is going to get completely wiped out, so this is why just having the threat of something like this in your deck can make your opponent think in a very different way when they play against you. 3 copies of Parallel Exceed. Of course, I've seen people play 2, and I don't really understand this, because you need to see this card. You need to summon Rafflesia turn 1 if you want to make Serra even more formidable, because otherwise she's just an 800 attack monster just waiting to get run over by any normal summon in the game. So I think you need to max this out, definitely, because she will not only will give you Rafflesia, but it also gives you other rank 4 options, like the Utopia Double I just talked about, or even more than that, because you can go into a Boral Sword as well with the deck. It's very easy. You don't even have to summon Utopia Double, because sometimes your opponent might have defense monsters or something that Utopia Double can't game, but Boral Sword can. So it's very easy to spam, and Parallel Exceed actually helps with that. And even if you have used Parallel Exceed turn 1 and then you draw the 3rd copy late game, that's not even that bad, because you're going to link summon Serra again eventually, or maybe even one of the new monster. So you are going to special summon, even if you don't get a special from the deck because you don't have another copy, you're still getting another level 4 monster on the field to exceed with, so I think maxing this out is absolutely important. The only spell I play in the deck is Double or Nothing. I don't think you need to play anything else, because if you play stuff like Desires, then you're messing with Traptrick ratios, and you're also messing with Parallel Exceed, possibly Banish 2, and maybe not having the effect to get to another copy. You don't really need it. If you have Prosperity, that's a decent card to play in the deck, but like I said, this is more of a budget version, so I didn't want to include something like that. And playing only Double or Nothing means that you can play Imperial Order in the main deck without any fears, because you don't really care if you don't have any spells in your deck, and even not being able to do the OTK with Utopia, that doesn't matter too much, because the deck can put a lot of damage on the field even without Utopia, but Imperial Order is just an auto-win against certain decks, so I think having only this spell in the deck makes it a little better. Now, of course, it's Traptrix, so we do play a ton of traps. We actually play 24 traps in this version, so let's start with the holes. We play 1 copy of Gravedigger's Hole, 1 copy of Floodgate Trap Hole, 1 copy of Bottomless Trap Hole, and 1 copy of Traptrix Trap Hole Nightmare. So I was testing 3 a little bit before, but I found that sometimes the 4th came up, so I decided to put in the Traptrix Trap Hole Nightmare. It's actually the one I did not have in the deck originally, but I felt like it didn't really hurt a lot to play a 4th copy, but it helped sometimes when we're going to a super grind game and Serra doesn't have another target for the deck, because hard drawing 1 and searching 1 with Vermelho means that you can only resolve Serra twice for the rest of the duel, and playing 3 meant that you could only resolve her once, which was not very optimal, so I felt like having 4 is a decent number. You can also play stuff like Time Space, you can also play duplicates of Great Diggers of Floodgate, but I wanted to have 4 different copies, and I felt Time Space was a little bit weird, because yes, it's a good card, but I felt like this deck grinds a lot, so it does lose to time a little bit, so I didn't want to get into the scenario where I would have to side out a hole because I was going to lose to time, so that's why I decided to go with these 4. And duplicates, yeah, you can play duplicates, but I felt like having 4 different uses of cards, especially since with Vesiculo you can recycle them, so you don't really need to play more copies of like Floodgate or your Gravediggers. You can always get them back with Dionia and Vesiculo, so I think just having 4 different ones is very optimal. 3 copies of Sade Brigandine. This is by far the best trap in the deck. I mean, just getting Time to Redoer with a trap and also getting Serra's Effect turn 1, it's so good, because Serra's Effect to set the hole is a thing, but you can get this very easily with Vesiculo. Getting to special summon a Traptrix from the deck and then set a hole, because those Traptrix you're going to special summoning is Mirmello, which is going to activate no matter what, even turn 1. So being able to activate a trap during your own turn is very, very important. If there's ever a new card, the new trap card that you can activate turn 1, that is actually a decent card, it's going to be such a huge boost for the deck, even if it's not direct support, because this deck is going to make so much use of it. Even if Brigandine was not a level 4 monster, which is by far the best thing you can do for a normal trap in this particular deck, it was going to be a really good card because it gives you so much advantage. And also, Vesiculo gives you the option, if you draw draw multiple copies of cards like Traptrix, of cards like Brigandine, which don't really serve a purpose if you draw more than one, then you can send them to the grave and trigger Sera's effect this way, even if you don't get any other effect to be able to trigger Sera. So you can send one of your holes to get a new trap, because having multiple copies of dead traps, especially in this deck, is something you cannot afford to have, because you need as many interruptions as possible in order to be able to play, especially against combo decks which have so many extenders. Decks like Dragon Link, you're going to need as much interruption as possible, and you need to hit certain choke points. So that's why Vesiculo is another use I forgot to mention that gives you the interruption you need and gets rid of the interruption you don't need. So this is another use of her. 3 copies of Compulse. This is a card that protects Sera, so you need to play 3 copies of this card, just because if you don't get Rafflesia turn 1 along with Sera, then Sera, like I said, is a very vulnerable card, so you need to play something to at least bounce the normal summon of a monster that is trying to run over Sera, because if your opponent runs over Sera before you have a chance to activate your normal traps, then you are not going to get as much advantage and you're going to get outgrinded very, very easily. This is the only weakness Sera has. That's why I think Vesiculo fixes that a little bit better, because before you only had 6 ways to get to Rafflesia at turn 1 along with Sera, but you would have to draw one of those 6 cards plus a Traptrix, but now Vesiculo gives you another option with Dionia, so this is why you need to play a card like this. 3 copies of Lost Wind. Lost Wind is a recurable card, and I think that it's a good card with Vesiculo. I was not playing it before, but now with Vesiculo, even if you need to special summon Vesiculo turn 1, you can send Lost Wind to the grave, and then Lost Wind is going to reset when your opponent summons a monster from the extra deck, so it's basically special summoning the monster for free, so you don't really need to send anything bad. If you don't have anything that you don't really need and you don't want to send to the grave, Lost Wind is the best card you can send to the grave, because it's going to come back by itself. 2 copies of Torrential Tribute. This is a card that I was considering to max, but to be honest, it's a card that against certain matchups is a little bit dead, and you do play 5 copies technically, because you play 3 more copies of any normal trap in the deck because of Traptrix. So when your opponent is going to special summon a monster, then you can chain Traptrix and then immediately flip Torrential when your opponent summons that monster, so it's not that bad. It's playing 5 copies instead of 2, but I didn't want to max it out because there are certain matchups that this card does nothing against. So against Eldritch or stuff like that, this card is really, really bad, and you can argue the same for Lost Wind, but Lost Wind sometimes, when your opponent tries to run over something with a 3500 attack Eldritch, if you flip the Lost Wind, then it loses a lot of attack and it won't be able to run over something like Rafflesia, so it's a bit better than Torrential against Eldritch matchups, but still Torrential is such a blowout against combo decks that I think you need to play it. You can also play Needle Sealing if you want, that's basically the same thing, but Torrential just makes sure that your opponent, even if they try to play around something like a Needle Sealing, which is very difficult to do to be honest, but still this card can completely win you games, and it's a really good board wipe. If you combo this with Strike, then you can basically Dark Hole your opponent's field without them being able to do anything about it. 2 copies of Heavy Storm Duster. We're going into a format where the variety is going to be a huge thing, so you don't really know exactly what you're going to be faced. Yes, we know what the best decks are going to be, probably, but we're going to face a lot of rogues, so I think having a little bit of backrow removal in the main deck, especially since it's searchable with Traptrix and gives you more advantage with Sera, I think it's a good thing. And Vesiculo also has that use, because when you're playing into a matchup that you know a card like Duster or maybe a card like Torrential is completely useless, you can just send it to the grave for fodder in order to special summon Vesiculo, so you don't really care having that card. You need something to send to the grave anyway, so you can afford now to play cards like these that might be completely dead against certain matchups, like, I don't know, maybe against maybe against Prank Kids it can be dead, especially going second, unless they use the field spell. So yeah, even if you have something like that, Vesiculo deals with that problem. You just send them to the grave, you get Vesiculo to the field, and you go from there. So yep, you don't really mind playing cards like these. 3 copies of Traptrix, of course, getting 3 more copies of every of your normal trap is really insane. 3 copies of Solemn Strike. I've seen people main decking Solemn Judgment, and I can understand why, because they're afraid of cards like Lightning Storm and Harpy's Feather Duster, but to be honest, nobody plays them in the main deck. At least most people don't play them in the main deck, so you can afford to side cards like maybe Starlight Road or Solemn Judgment if you want even more protection, but you don't really have to main deck them. And Solemn Strike is such a good card to main deck in a trap deck, because you can't afford to play hand traps. I've tried playing hand traps in the deck, but whenever I did, I felt like my hands were getting way worse because I didn't have enough traps, or maybe I didn't have a Traptrix in my hand in order to do the combo. So I felt like trying to break an established board with traps is much more optimal than trying to hand trap them and stop them from making that board, because half the time hand traps will not even stop them from making that board, so you basically neg for nothing. But also cards like traps like Torrential and Strike comboing together, they're going to destroy pretty much any kind of board your opponent has, so it's not even that bad playing them and letting them make whatever they want and try to break that board. So this is why I think Strike is a really good card going first and going second. And the last card is 1 copy of Imperial Order. I mean, what's else to say about this card? In a deck that you only play 1 spell card, yes, you're going to play this card and you're going to completely blow out your opponent, because against certain matchups your opponent will not be able to do anything unless they use the spells, because Dragon Link is a really good deck, but if they are not able to use cards like Quick Launch or the field spells with Ravine and the Boot Sector Launch to get more monsters on the field, they will not be able to do much. Imperial Order just seals the deal field against those types of decks, and it's a one-off that if you see, you're most certainly going to win the game if the matchup is good for that card. If you're playing against something like Eldritch, then, like I said before, it's fodder for Vesiculo. For the extra deck, we have 2 copies of Serra. You don't really need to max Serra because by the time you get to the super late game, you don't really even need to summon Serra in order to get more advantage. You basically have everything you want on the field. You're basically playing rank 4 spam at that point, or Boral Sword OTK, because Serra is just to get you through the early and mid game to get you enough disruption and more monsters out of your deck. And then once you're gone through that point, you have so much advantage over your opponent that you don't need to get even more. You just wipe them out, or your opponent scoops it up because they know that they don't have enough resources to play around the interruptions you have amassed throughout the entire game. Now we have a new monster. We have 1 copy of Traptrix Killaria. Now Killaria is a card that you don't really want to summon early game because unfortunately it cannot bring back Serra. If it was able to bring back Serra from the grave during the end phase, it would be such a better card, but unfortunately it has to bring it in defense mode, so it cannot bring back Link monsters, but it's a really good card to play. So first of all, this card, when you activate your holes, they just reset instead of going to the grave, so that's really good. And during your end phase, you special summon a Traptrix from your grave in defense mode. So this card gives you more advantage, so it's a card you want to summon after you've summoned Serra. If you don't really need to keep Serra on the field, then you can summon this, because it's a monster that has 1,000 attack points more than Serra, which is decent, and then you get more monsters from the grave. So what the deck tries to do is trying to get a lot more monsters throughout the game, and then while also disrupting your opponent with the traps, and then eventually going for something like a Utopia Double or Boil Sword in order to OTK. So I think this card helps a lot. Also being a monster that if you have a Serra on the field, you would have to summon something like a Phoenix in order to use Parallel Exceed's effect if you draw it a little later, but now you can link off Serra for this, and then you can go to your Parallel Exceed. Otherwise you would have to use 2 other monsters, not including Serra, for a Phoenix to summon under Serra, and then you would have to use Parallel Exceed with that, but this card makes it much better. And Parallel Exceed does not even occupy the link arrow, because after you've used both Exceeds, you just Exceed summon somewhere else, and you free the link arrow so you can special summon from the grave. 1 copy of Link Spider. The reason Link Spider is here is because of the Shade Brigandine. So sometimes when you don't draw a Traptrix, there is a way to get to Serra without hard drawing a Traptrix, to be honest. You can use, it's a little bit of neck play, but getting to Serra is never a neck. So you use your Shade Brigandine, and then you summon a Link Spider, and then you use Parallel Exceed, and then you use both Exceeds to make either Rafflesia or Alomerus. Most likely Alomerus. You don't really want to waste your Rafflesia to link her for Serra. And Serra, fortunately, you can use Exceeds Traptrix monsters to link summon her. So there is this cool little combo you can do in order to summon a Serra without actually drawing a Traptrix monster. So this is why I think Link Spider is a good addition to the extra deck, especially in an extra deck that doesn't really have a lot of space issues. You can afford to play something like this. Play Nightmare Phoenix and Nightmare Unicorn, some more removal. The deck actually needs it sometimes because established boards, when you try to play around established boards, sometimes the traps are not enough, or maybe something tries to remain on the field, and then you need cards like this in order to deal with them. 1 copy of Boral Sword. You can replace this with Access Code, to be honest, but I feel like Boral Sword is a little bit more optimal in this particular deck because you don't really care about popping cards. You actually care about leaving cards on the field that Boral Sword and Utopia Double can OTK through, because Boral Sword needs something to attack on in order to boost its attack, and Utopia Double cannot attack directly, and the Utopia you put on top of Utopia Double cannot attack directly, so you need your opponent to have something on the field. So I think a little bit, just for a little bit, Boral Sword is a little bit better, and of course it's more budget because some people do not have Access Code, so this is why in a budget version Boral Sword is much more optimal. For the Exceeds monsters, we play 1 copy of Rafflesia. I think Rafflesia is by far the most important monster in the extra deck. I mean, of course, aside from Serra, because like I said, she goes in tandem with Serra. If you don't have Rafflesia and Serra's on the field, if you don't have a way to get to compulsory, then you're going to get completely blown out. Unless your opponent doesn't have any idea what to do and they start playing without even thinking about going to the battle phase first, and then you don't have a problem, but still being able to protect your Serra from battle is very, very important. Also, Serra is unaffected by trap effects, and the same thing goes for Rafflesia, so if you torrential under these two, they will go nowhere and your opponent's field is going bye-bye. So this is why these cards are so important, because usually Traptrix monsters are unaffected by hole effects, but these two are unaffected by trap effects, so you can just destroy them with a torrential without you losing any of your monsters. 1 copy of Alomerus. The 2 reasons she's here is maybe because you will draw this to play, like I said, with Link Spider and Parallax with Shade Brigandine, and then you need another monster in order to link this away. Also, she's a good monster to extend. Sometimes you detach 2 and you special summon a Traptrix from the grave. Maybe you can get a Mirmela with this to pop a back row. The effect to steal your opponent's monsters when they're destroying their now the banished stone in the graveyard doesn't come up ever, but it's something to keep in mind because you never know what's going to happen in a game. So yeah, try to remember that effect too. We play the Utopia package, which is Utopia Double, Utopia, and Utopia the Lightning. So whenever I try to play this package in anything, I try to incorporate Utopia the Lightning too, because in decks like these, your opponent most likely will expect you that you have this, even if they haven't seen it in like a previous game, even if it's game 1, they expect you to have something like this in your deck, so they might try to keep an interruption for the Utopia double, and when that happens, like for example, if your Utopia double gets ashed, then it sits there doing absolutely nothing. But if you do have a lightning in your extra deck, you just slap lightning on top of your Utopia double, and you do have a lightning with 2 materials that can use its effect to double the attack twice. So not only did your opponent use an interruption on this, but you still have something to attack with, which is not Utopia with 10,000 attack points, but a 5,000 attacker that's Armades. It's pretty good. So I think if you have the space to play something like this and you want to incorporate in a deck the Utopia double engine, then I suggest playing Utopia the Lightning. Trust me, you're not going to regret it, because half the times, even more than that, Utopia double is not going to resolve. 1 copy of Redoer, Shade Brigandine gives it a trap under it, so it's a very optimal way to put another interruption on the field if you don't really want to summon Rafflesia. 1 Baguska, because it kills some matchups, and 1 Tornado Dragon, because it's good in other matchups. So yep, that's the deck, guys. Traptrix, I think it's a deck that a lot of people love, even budget players love it, even players that don't really mind spending a little bit more money can make it work a little bit more efficiently with Dogmatica. I want to test a little bit more the Amazement deck, because I'm not sure if it's more optimal than the pure version. It's definitely a little bit more fun, because Arlecchino is basically a multi-faker for traps in general that gives you Horror House and more stuff. I'm going to experiment a little bit later. If you want to see that, if you want to see the Amazement Traptrix, comment down below if you want to see that profile, and I'm going to prepare it for you. But for now, I decided to keep it budget, I decided to keep it real for most people, so this is what I've come up with. I think it's basically the most optimal version of a deck going into a blind format when we get a better idea of what decks we're going to be facing. Then maybe switching our ratios or switching around certain traps is going to be more optimal. But for a format that we don't really know what we're going to face in variety, we know that variety is going to be a huge thing. I think playing all of these cards I just mentioned is going to give you an edge against a lot of matchups. So yep, that's the deck, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming videos, and we'll see you next time.